Montana Territory, October 1882. The morning sky was pale and cold above the Judith Basin when Willa Jane Jamison stepped down from the train platform. Her gloved hands clenched tight around the worn leather handle of her valise. The wind tugged at the hem of her dark blue gown, and dust curled around her boots like warning whispers. She had not cried when she left St. Louis. She did not cry now, but her heart thudded like hooves in her chest. She was 21, and this was her wedding day. The man she was to marry, Baron Alistair Harrow, waited at the end of the platform, flanked by 2 ranch hands and a buggy that gleamed too fine for a place like Denton Creek. He wore a black coat too heavy for the season and eyes like river ice. Willa had met him only once, a month ago, when he came to settle her father's gambling debt with a contract and a single sentence, "Your daughter will do." She had signed because her father was dying and the debt would have left her and her little brother starving in the street. Now her father was buried and her brother Charlie had been sent to live with relatives in Kansas. She was alone, and she was about to become the property of a man who looked at her the way a man looked at land he meant to fence off and break. "Miss Jamison," Baron Harrow said, offering his arm. "Come. We have a schedule to keep." She hesitated. Just a breath. Then she placed her hand on his arm. They rode in silence for nearly an hour through rough, empty country. The Baron's ranch, Ira Hold, sat at the base of a low ridge, the house looming like a fortress over the land. The air smelled of ash. As they neared the house, Willa saw what had once been a barn, burned out, blackened timbers jutting into the sky. A man was being dragged across the yard by 2 others. His shirt was torn. Blood streaked the side of his face. "Who is that?" Willa asked, her voice dry. The Baron did not answer. He only smiled, thin and cold. Inside, the ceremony was waiting. A priest. A paper. A ring. She signed. He kissed her, hard and without warmth. By dusk, she was a wife. That night, locked in a room with a bolt on the outside, Willa sat on the edge of the bed, her heart hollow. She stared at the wall until her eyes could not focus, then curled up beneath the covers, her hands curled into fists beneath her pillow. She did not sleep. Morning broke fast and golden across the plains. And that was the day everything changed. Ira Fletcher had been riding since dawn. He did not much like Denton Creek. Too many men with too much land and not enough soul. But he had business to finish, deliver a letter to a ranch hand named Eli, who owed him a favor from the war, and then he meant to turn back west before the snow came. He stopped at a creek to water his horse, a tall roan named Dust. That was when he heard the cry. It was sharp, human. A woman. Ira stood, scanned the ridge and saw smoke. He kicked his boot into the stirrup and rode fast. The trail twisted through scrub and rock, but the smoke was fresh, and the sound of shouting drew clearer with each stride. He crested the hill and saw the ranch below. Men circled a corral. Inside, a woman stood with her back to the gate. Her dark hair had come loose beneath a crooked bonnet. Her dress was torn at the hem. In front of her, a man taller, broad-shouldered, bleeding from a cut along his cheek, stood between her and a bull, which had been goaded into a frenzy. The men jeered. One cracked a whip against the side of the corral. Ira did not think. He rode straight down the slope and into the yard, pulling his rifle from the sling on his saddle. "Back away from the pen," he shouted. The men turned, startled. "Who the hell are you?" one asked. But Ira had already dismounted. He cocked the rifle. "I said back away." The Baron stepped out onto the porch, arms folded. "You have a death wish, cowboy?" "Ira Fletcher," he said, "and I have a loaded rifle pointed at your hired men." The Baron's eyes narrowed. "You were trespassing on my land." "I heard a woman scream," Ira said, his voice low. "That makes it my business." The Baron's lip curled. "She is my wife. I do not care if she is the Queen of England. Let her out of that pen. Now." The Baron stood silent for a beat too long. Then he nodded. "Open the gate." The hired hand unlatched the corral. The man inside grabbed the woman's hand and pulled her clear just as the bull charged the fence. Ira held the gate open while they stumbled out. The woman looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and fury and something else, something like hope. Her eyes were blue-gray, fierce under the bruised sky. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "Ira," he said simply. "Willa." He nodded once. "You were coming with me." She blinked. "What? You are not staying here?" "Not one more hour." "I cannot, I am not asking." He turned to the man beside her. "Are you hurt?" "No. Just mad as hell." "Then get on a horse." Ira pointed to the stable. "You too, Willa." The Baron stepped forward. "She is my wife. You think you can ride in here and steal her away in the light of day?" "I do not steal," Ira said. "I rescue." And then he raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air. The horses screamed. The men scattered. Ira grabbed Willa's hand and pulled her toward Dust. She ran with him without a word. The other man, Eli, he guessed was already mounting. They rode hard out of the yard, past the smoking barn and the scorched fences and the cruel man shouting behind them. They did not stop until they were 10 miles out and the sun was low. Ira led them to a narrow canyon where the wind could not find them. He lit a fire and handed Willa his coat when he saw her shivering. She took it without protest. Her hands trembled. "Thank you," she said again, voice soft. He sat across from her. "You looked like you needed saving." "I did." She looked at him then. Really looked. His hair was sun-bleached at the edges, his jaw lined with dust and stubble. He looked like the kind of man who had seen too much and kept riding anyway. "Why did you help me?" He met her gaze. "Because no woman should be locked in a pen like cattle." She swallowed. "You will not take me back, will you?" "No," he said. "Never." She stared at the fire. "He will come after us." "Let him," Ira said. "Let him try." For a long time, they sat in silence. The canyon walls echoed with the sound of wind and horses settling. Then she looked at him again. "Ira." "Yes." "Can I stay with you?" "Just until I figure out what comes next." He looked at her, not just her face, but the way she held herself, the fire in her spine even after everything. She was not broken, not even close. "You can stay as long as you want, Willa." And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed someone meant it. The canyon held its warmth longer than the open plains, but by nightfall, the fire was their only guard against the creeping chill. Ira crouched beside it, feeding dry branches into the flame. Willa sat with her knees drawn to her chest, her gaze fixed on the darkened trail behind them. "When I was little," she said, voice low, "I thought Montana would be all green valleys and wildflowers. Like the paintings in the books my mother left." Ira didn't interrupt. He let the wind fill the silence between them. "Instead, it's dust and smoke and men with hard hands," she continued. "I don't know what's left of me. You're still here. That counts." She looked over, the firelight catching the edge of her cheekbone. "You don't know what he was like." "No," Ira said, "but I saw enough to know what he ain't." She shifted, pulling his coat tighter around her. The lining smelled faintly of cedar and horsehair. "You ever been married?" she asked. He shook his head once. "No. Came close once." She didn't wait. Willa watched the flame flicker. "You loved her." "I thought I did. Turns out I loved the idea of what we could be more than what we were." She didn't ask what happened. She just nodded like she understood. "Where will you go?" he asked after a while. "I don't know yet. East, maybe? If I can find work." She hesitated, then added, "I can sew, and I kept our books back home. I'm not helpless." "I didn't say you were." "No. But I've been treated like livestock since I stepped off that train. It does things to a person." He leaned back against a stone outcrop, stretching his legs toward the fire. "Folks forget a woman's got grit until she's already bled for it." She exhaled slowly, then laid her head back against her rolled shawl. "You always talk like that?" "Like what?" "Like you've been talking to ghosts too long." He chuckled, quiet and low. "Maybe I have." They slept in turns. Ira took the first watch, rifle across his lap. Willa curled beneath a wool blanket, one hand tucked beneath her chin. She didn't stir except once, near dawn, when she muttered something too soft to catch and pressed her face into the crook of her arm. By morning, the sky was the color of pewter and frost tipped the edges of the canyon grass. Ira brewed coffee over the coals and Willa took her cup without a word, wrapping her fingers around it like a lifeline. They rode out after the horses were fed, moving west toward the river. Ira knew a trapper's cabin tucked into a stand of cottonwoods. Half a day's ride out. He figured it would give them a roof and time to think. As they rode, Willa asked, "You know this land well?" "Well enough. I ran cattle up near Fort Benton one winter, back when there was still buffalo running this way." "You've seen a lot." "Seen too much some days." She was quiet after that, until they reached a narrow pass, where the wind funneled between stone teeth. A hawk lifted from a ledge above them, wings wide against the gray. "Did you mean it?" she asked suddenly. "When you said I could stay as long as I wanted? I don't say what I don't mean. I'm not sure I know how to trust that anymore." Ira met her eyes across the space between their saddles. "You don't have to. Not today." The trapper's cabin was smaller than Willa expected, just a single room with a sod roof and a shuttered window, but it was clean, tucked back from the trail, and dry inside. Ira unsaddled the horses while Willa swept out the hearth and set kindling for a fire. She found a tin of salt and a sack of beans, and by dusk they were eating beside the flame again, seated closer than the night before, not touching, but near enough to feel the warmth off each other's skin. "You ever think about leaving it all behind?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then, every day. But I don't know what I'd be if I stopped moving." "I think you'd still be kind," Willa said. "And steady." He looked over at her, eyes steady. "You don't know me." "No," she said. "But I'm learning." Outside, a coyote called. The wind shifted and the fire popped. Willa didn't look away when she said, "I don't want to go east." Ira sat very still. "I want to stay," she said. "If you'll let me." "You don't need permission." She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "I want to work, to earn my keep. I can cook, mend, help with the horses. I don't want to be a burden." "You're not." "I don't want pity either. You won't get it." She looked at him then, and something passed between them, quiet, but rooted deep. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. "I won't run," she said. "I won't let anyone take you." She reached across the space between them and laid her hand over his. He didn't move, just let her fingers rest there. For the first time in weeks, she felt still. Not safe, not entirely, but steadied. Like the worst was behind her and something real might live in the silence ahead. Neither of them spoke again that night. They didn't need to. The wind was quieter in the cottonwoods that morning, the kind of hush that settled after long storms. Willa stepped outside the cabin with Ira's spare hat pulled low over her brow, arms folded against the cold. The frost hadn't lifted yet, but the light was clearer than it had been in days, the kind that made things feel possible. Ira was down by the creek, sleeves rolled, checking the snare lines he'd set at dawn. She watched him squat beside a log, movements unhurried, even as the earth hardened beneath the season's turn. His steadiness grounded her in a way she hadn't known she needed. When he returned, a pair of rabbits dangled from his belt. He handed them to her without a word, and she took them to the chopping stump beside the cabin. She didn't flinch as she worked, not out of numbness, but because she'd decided she would not be a woman who turned away from what needed doing. "I thought you might want to know," Ira said, leaning against the doorframe once the fire was going again. "There's a mail runner camped 2 miles upriver. He's heading east next week, passing through Fort Shaw." Willa set the kettle over the coals. "You think I ought to send word to someone? I wondered if you might want to choose who knows you're alive." "I don't have many left to tell," she said. Then, after a pause, "But I'll write Charlie. He's my brother. Just turned 9. Ira gave a small nod. "He the kind to worry quiet or loud?" "Quiet," Willa said. "Like you." His eyes held hers a second longer than necessary. "You write it. I'll see it gets where it should." She poured 2 mugs and handed him one. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Later that day, while Ira mended tack out front, Willa sat on an upturned crate by the hearth. The pencil she'd found in the trapper's drawer gripped tight between her fingers. The letter didn't come easy. She started and stopped more than once, not knowing how to explain what had happened without breaking something in Charlie she didn't want broken. When she finally set the pencil down, her hand ached. She folded the page and tucked it into an envelope Ira had offered her from his saddlebag. She added no return address. That night, after supper, they sat by the fire with their boots off, her feet tucked beneath her, his stretched toward the flames. "Ira," she said, "how long were you a soldier?" He rubbed a thumb along the edge of his cup. 3 winters. Missouri Regiment. I was 17 when I signed. Did you ever go back? No reason to. My folks died while I was gone. Farm was sold off. She let that settle. Was that when you started drifting? He gave a small shrug. Not much left to anchor me. She didn't speak right away. Then, I think I'd like to see your horse ranch if it still exists. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. It's not much, just a patch of land west of Helena. Cabins smaller than this one. Is it yours? For now. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. I don't want to live behind someone's fences again. You wouldn't, he said. She looked up. You saying that like it's decided? I'm saying it like it could be if you want it to be. The fire cracked between them. Outside, the creek murmured under its thin skin of ice. I don't know what love's supposed to look like, she said quietly. But I know what it isn't. He didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her. He just said, me neither. But I reckon love's something you build, not something you're handed. She nodded slowly. I want to build something. Then we will. When she stood, he did too. She stepped toward him barefoot on the plank floor. He didn't touch her until she placed her hand against his chest, just over his shirt where the fabric was warm with him. I feel steady here, she said. He covered her hand with his own. Then stay. Their foreheads met gently. No rush. No promises beyond the one already made when he'd pulled her from that corral and chosen not to let go. When she kissed him, it wasn't hesitant. It was quiet and sure and full of something that had nothing to do with rescue and everything to do with being seen. That night, they slept side by side, not for warmth but because they wanted to. And outside, the cottonwoods kept their still vigil, branches etched against a deepening sky. 3 days passed in the still hush of the woods, marked only by the soft rhythm of work and the quiet company they kept. Willa patched the saddle blanket with twine from Ira's pack and a square of old shirt she found tucked behind the hearth, her stitches small and steady. Ira brought back a pheasant one morning, and they roasted it over a low fire, leaning in close when the wind kicked up. On the 4th morning, Willa stood at the cabin door before dawn, her shawl pulled snug, watching the sky lighten over the trees. She didn't turn when Ira stepped outside behind her. Baron's got money, he said, voice rough from sleep. That kind of man doesn't give up easy. I know. He'll look west. He'll pay folks to ask questions. I'm not afraid of him anymore. He looked at her sidelong. That doesn't mean you won't need to be careful. I've thought about that, she said. There's a town near Helena called Crow's Bluff. Old widow there runs a boarding house. She offered me work once before the wedding. I turned her down then, but she might still remember me. You want to go? I want to stop hiding. Ira nodded once, then rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. I could ride out ahead, speak to her myself. Make sure it's still safe. Willa shook her head. If I'm going to face things, I need to start walking into places on my own feet. He didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside and let her pass, following her down to the creek where the horses were grazing between the willows. That afternoon, they packed what little they had: jerky, dry beans, a few tins, the rifle, and Willa's letter to Charlie, and headed west. The trail wound through open country, gold with dry grass and scattered pine. They camped that night beneath a bluff, the stars sharp above them. Willa spread her bedroll beside Ira's, close enough their shoulders touched when they lay down, but neither of them reached for more. Not yet. The next day, a rider passed them on the trail just before noon. He wore a flat-crowned hat and had a rifle slung across his back. But he nodded politely and didn't slow. Willa watched him go with narrowed eyes. Something wrong? Ira asked. He looked like one of Harrow's men. I saw him once in the yard. You sure? Not sure. But I don't forget faces. Ira slowed his horse. We'll cut off the trail at the next rise. Take the long way around. They rode in silence after that, keeping to the trees when they could. That night, they made camp in a dry wash and built no fire. Willa lay awake long after Ira's breathing had gone deep and even. The dark didn't frighten her. What kept her eyes open was the question she hadn't yet asked. When dawn came, she waited until they were back in the saddle before she spoke. Ira, if I hadn't been in that corral, if you'd just seen me walking down the street, would you have stopped? He didn't answer right away. Would you have seen me? I would have noticed, he said finally. But you wouldn't have looked at me. You don't know that. I do. You'd have been married to a rich man. I'd have been just another trail-worn stranger. She let that sit between them a moment, then said, But I wasn't. And you weren't. No, he said. We weren't. They reached Crow's Bluff by the second evening, the sun just beginning to dip behind the low ridge that marked the eastern edge of town. It was a modest place, some 30 buildings, a livery, a church, and the boarding house with its green shutters and tidy porch. Willa dismounted before the steps and tied her mare to the rail, smoothing her skirt with both hands. Ira stayed beside the horses, watching her with unreadable eyes. She knocked once. A moment later, the door opened. Mercy, the woman said, pushing her spectacles up her nose. Willa Jamison, is that you? I'm Willa Harrow now, she said quietly. But I'd rather not be. The woman blinked, then stepped aside. Well, come in, child. We've got space upstairs. You can tell me what you need once you've eaten. Willa turned, half expecting Ira to follow. But he hadn't moved. You're not coming in? He shook his head. I'll stay at the livery. Let you have your own space a while. She stepped down the porch toward him. I don't want space. You need to decide this part on your own. Not because I'm beside you. Her heart beat hard at that, not from fear, but from the sharpness of how much she wanted him near. You'll come back. I'll be right down the street. Ira. He looked up. If I decide I want a life with you, will you still want one with me? He stepped forward then, closing the distance between them. I already do, he said. But I'll wait until you're sure. She nodded, and her breath caught, not from sorrow this time, but from the simple weight of being given the choice. I'll be sure soon, she said. He touched the brim of his hat. I know. The boarding house's windows caught the morning sun like panes of gold. Willa stood behind one of them, her hair still damp from a basin wash, sleeves rolled to the elbow as she scrubbed the sill. Mrs. Pettigrew had handed her a bucket and brush without fuss, and Willa welcomed the ache in her arms. It was honest work, not a performance, not obedience. Ira Fletcher left this for you, Mrs. Pettigrew said from the hallway. She handed over a folded scrap of paper, creased at the edges. Willa took it, her hands damp and raw from lie. She didn't open it right away. She watched the dust shift in the light and listened to the quiet clatter of dishes below. When she did read it, his handwriting was slanted and spare. He'd found a job backing a cattle drive that passed just south of town. A 3-day ride. He would return by the following week. She pressed the paper flat on her lap and sat very still. There was no fear in the words, only trust. That steadied her more than his presence ever had. By the 4th day, she had memorized the rhythm of the boarding house mornings: coal scuttle at dawn, bread in the brick oven by first light, linens hung and turned before noon. Her hands were blistered but capable. Her voice, when she used it, no longer trembled. Mrs. Pettigrew watched her from the kitchen doorway one afternoon, wiping her hands on her apron. You got a decision to make, girl, she said without preamble. You plan on staying here, I'll teach you everything I know. But if you're only waiting on that cowboy, you ought to say it plain. I'm not waiting, Willa said. I'm deciding. Same thing, different boots on. Willa folded the tea towel in her hands. He didn't tell me to choose. That's why I can. Mrs. Pettigrew gave a small grunt of approval and left her to the dishes. When Ira returned, he didn't send word ahead. She saw him through the front parlor window, walking his horse beside him, dust up to the knees, a canvas sack slung over his shoulder. He paused near the steps, squinting at the porch like he wasn't certain he was welcome. Willa opened the door herself. I brought you something, he said, lifting the sack. She took it. Inside was a pair of leather gloves. Not new but well-oiled, sized for her hands. She turned them over slowly. They belonged to the rancher's daughter, he said. She gave them up when she married a banker and moved to Butte. Said she didn't miss the dirt. I do, Willa said. Miss having dirt under my nails. It means I'm doing something. He looked at her carefully. You decided? I have. She stepped aside and he entered. The parlor smelled of lemon balm and rising bread. Willa led him to a bench beside the window where the light fell soft and slanted. I want a life, she said. Not just safety, not just freedom. A life with roots, with work, with someone who sees me. I see you. I know. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded page. I wrote Charlie again. Told him I'll send for him come spring. Said I won't be alone when he arrives. Ira's brow lifted slightly. You sure? I've never been more. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I've got that claim west of Helena. It needs a roof patched and fences mended. But there's grass and water and room for a garden. That's all I want. He reached for her hand, rough palm closing over her fingers. I can't promise ease, Willa, but I can promise honesty. And room to be who you are. She held his gaze. Then let's go home. They left Crow's Bluff 2 days later after Mrs. Pettigrew packed them a sack of bread and dried apples and told Willa she'd earned more than coin in her time there. The trail north was slow with the weight of their pack horse and the steady pace of a pair not in a hurry to outrun anything. At night, they bedded beneath the stars, her head tucked beneath his chin, his arms folded around her like a promise made without ceremony. By the time they reached Ira's land, the trees around the property had begun to turn. The cabin was weathered but standing, the well still clean. Willa scrubbed the hearth with ashes and water while Ira dragged a cot inside and set about fixing the shutter that hung crooked on its hinge. The first morning, she found a patch of earth beside the porch and began turning it with a spade. He watched her a moment before joining her in the dirt. By the second week, the roof no longer leaked. By the third, she'd sewn curtains from an old flour sack and hung them across the windows. One evening, as frost dusted the fields, Ira brought out a small box from the saddlebag he'd kept beneath the bed. I traded 2 pelts and a saddle cinch for it, he said, setting it in her hands. Inside lay a plain gold band, dulled at the edges but whole. She looked up at him. I already said yes. This is just for you to wear, if you want. She slid it onto her finger. I do. They married in a clearing behind the cabin with only the quiet woods and the crows in the branches as witness. Ira carved their initials into the doorframe that evening, and Willa traced the letters with her fingertips before stepping inside the home they'd made together. Years passed, slow and steady as the river below the bluff. Charlie arrived that spring, taller than she remembered, all elbows and questions. He took to Ira like kindling to flame, trailing him through the fields and learning the names of clouds and tools alike. Willa taught him to read by lantern light. The 3 of them gathered close while snow fell heavy outside. The land gave them enough and they asked for no more than that. In time, Willa planted a row of lilacs by the road. Each spring, they bloomed a little thicker. And every night, after the fire burned low and the house settled soft around them, Ira drew her close beneath the quilt she'd stitched from scraps, and they slept with the peace of people who had built something lasting from the broken pieces they carried in. They never spoke of Denton Creek again. Not because they forgot, but because they no longer had to. Their life was not easy, but it was true, and that was more than enough.